A giant of a ton, the pride of an entire farm, decides to surrender to death. For 5 torturous days, Goliath, the bull, refuses to eat, his massive body wilting under the weight of an invisible pain. Experienced veterinarians and a dedicated owner try everything, but the barrier of their sadness is impenetrable. Hope fades like dry land water, and the farm is preparing for the inevitable. But when all experience fails, an impossible solution is presented. A 10-year-old girl, blind from birth, who sees the world not with her eyes, but with the heart. What could a child, who does not see the scary grandeur of the bull, do to make strong and wise men could not succeed? What secret could she whisper that would have the power to call a soul back from the abyss? This is the story of a meeting that challenges logic, proving that true communication transcends vision, and that sometimes healing to the deepest pain lies in the smoother voice and the most innocent touch. In the vast plains that stretched out as a sea of emerald under the blue sky of the backlands, the Alvarado farm knew the harmony of the days, the uninterrupted cycle of life and work. Each creature, from the smallest of birds to the most robust of animals, played its role in a silent symphony governed by the sun and the moon. In the center of this universe of order and routine, lived Goliath, a noble bull, whose presence was as imposing as the old belly trees that dotted the landscape. His black coat shone like polished obsidian, his muscles moved with the quiet strength of a breathless mountain, and his eyes, once full of a flame of wild vitality, were now 2 wells of unfathomable sadness. Goliath was the pride of the farm, a giant that symbolized the strength and prosperity of those lands. But the strength that emanated from his colossal physical form seemed to have gone out, leaving behind only an empty housing, a monument of silent pain that no one could completely decipher. The sun was born and wiped, painting the sky with vibrant colors. But for Goliath, the world had plunged into a perpetual twilight, a shadow of which he could not or wanted to escape, a deep mourning. The routine of the Alvarado farm had been broken 5 days earlier, suddenly and alarmingly. That's when Goliath, the bull that had never rejected a meal, who devoured the freshest hay and sweetest molasses with a voracious appetite, simply stopped eating. On the first day, the keepers thought it is a passing malaise, perhaps excessive heat, or some momentary indisposition. They offered him fresh water, the best pasture, but he just drifted his head, his large body immovable as a basalt statue. Her eyes, usually alert and curious, settled in a distant point, a void that only he seemed to see, an invisible horizon where his pain resided. The refusal was passive but firm, an insurmountable barrier of melancholy. Untouched food was a daily testimony of his unshakable decision, a silent protest against a loss that the world around him did not understand. The aroma of fresh silage, which would once make him get up with an anxious bray, was now just a strange perfume in a world that had lost all his taste and meaning. The entire farm seemed to hold its breath, watching the giant define. The cause of his anguish was a secret kept in his animal heart, but the elders of the farm suspected. Goliath had grown next to Estrella, an old white mare that had been his inseparable companion since he was just a clumsy calf. She was the calm for her butte strength, the softness that balanced her power. They grazed together, drank water from the same trough, and rested in the shadow of the same tree. Estrella had departed a week ago, her life gently extinguishing as a candle falls in the wind, one by age. For humans, it was the natural order of things, a complete cycle. But for Goliath, it was the collapse of his universe. The pasture looked vast and empty without the white spot of his coat beside him. The sound of the wind on the leaves no longer brought the smooth religion that soothed his spirit. He was alone, a king without his queen, a giant lost in a maze of longing. His hunger strike was not a body disease, but a wound in the soul, a way of telling the world that a vital part of himself had been torn, and he did not know how to continue to live with that void. The days dragged on heavy and slow, each adding a new layer of concern to the faces of the farm workers. The veterinarian had come in and out, shaking his head in impotence. Physically, Goliath was healthy, or at least it had been before he started his fast. There was no fever, no sign of infection, no visible injury that could explain its condition. The disease, concluded the man of science, was not in his muscles or in his blood, but in something deeper, something that medicines and injections could not achieve. Sadness was a slow poison, and was consuming the great bull from the inside out. His monumental force, which was once a source of admiration, now only accentuated the tragedy of his condition. He was surrendering, his robust body starting to show the signs of weakness, the shine of his coat becoming opaque, the hip bones starting to stand out subtly under the skin. Impotence was a bitter feeling that spread throughout the farm like a plague, affecting everyone. On the 5th day, hope was beginning to become despair. Goliath barely moved. He spent hours lying on the dry earth, his flank climbing and down at a slow and shallow pace. His eyes, once focused on the void, were now often closed, as if he were saying goodbye to the world of light and life. The silence around his surrounding was heavy, broken only by the buzz of the flies and the worried murmurs of the Tyans, who watched him from afar, not knowing what to do. They tried everything. They brought other animals close, hoping to arouse their social instinct. They played soft songs on the radio, hoping that some melody could break the spell of their melancholy. Nothing worked. Goliath remained in his own world of mourning, inaccessible, unattainable. The feeling that they were watching a giant die slowly was torture for everyone, a cruel reminder that not all the strength and knowledge of man could heal a broken heart, especially the heart of a creature who could not express his pain in words. The afternoon sun on the 5th day was thrown long shadows on the earth, and the air was loaded with the resignation of defeat. The owner of the farm, a man with heated hands and kind heart, looked at his bull awarded a pain that mirrored his own. Hey guys, he did not only see the bull's financial value fading, he saw a friend, a creature he becomes born and grow, a part of the soul of the farm. The decision of perhaps having to sacrifice him to end his suffering hovered in the air like a storm cloud, a terrible idea that no one dared to verbalize. It would be an act of mercy, some would say, but to the farmer, it would look like a failure, a betrayal. He remembered Goliath like a calf, running awkwardly behind his mother, and then, as a young and proud bull, challenging the world with his power. Seeing him like this, surrendered and weak, was a vision that broke his heart. The farm seemed to be mourning along with its giant, the usual joy and liveliness replaced by a dark stillness. Goliath's immobility was a more powerful form of communication than any mute. It was a statement that his spirit was broken. Star's absence was a hole in his existence, and he had chosen to fall into this abyss instead of trying to get around him. For a flock animal, the loss of a close companion is a deep disorientation. The dynamics of the group changes, the security of familiarity disappears. For Goliath, Estrella was not just a mate. She was her point of reference, her north. Without her, he was drifting into an ocean of silence and loneliness. The other animals seemed to understand. They maintained a respectful distance, as if they recognized the holiness of their pain. The birds did not sing so happily near their surroundings. The wind seemed to whisper lament as it passed through the wooden fences. The whole nature seemed to be in collusion with his suffering, respecting his decision to move away from the world of the living. The image of the bull, once the epitome of the life force, was now a picture of desolation. His breathing was the only sign that life was still pulsating into his massive body. The dust accumulated on his back, and he made no effort to get rid of it. The thirst certainly tormented him, but the will to die was stronger than the instinct to survive. It was a painful spectacle, a silent lesson about the depth of loyalty and love in the animal kingdom. Such a pure and overwhelming emotion that it could literally stop a heart, or at least the desire to keep it hitting. The farm, which had already been the scene of so much life, was now the scenario of a funeral vigil for a being that was still breathing. The night approached, and with her, the feeling that time was running out. If a miracle did not happen, The next morning could bring confirmation of the loss, the final silence of the giant Goliath. The narrative of his suffering had spread beyond the limits of the farm. Travelers and neighbors heard the history of the bull who died of love, and it became a kind of local legend, a sad fable told in a low voice. The story of Goliath touched a universal rope of empathy. He talked about the pain of loss, a feeling that all human beings know well. The inability of men to cure it emphasized the fragility of life and the limits of human control over nature and its most primordial emotions. The giant in his surroundings was no longer just an animal. He was a symbol of the depth of pain that can accompany great love, a testimony of the truth that the bonds that connect us, whether human or animals, are the essence of our existence, and when they break, they can lead with them their own will to live. The night fell over the Dawn farm, dark, full of omens, involving the bull in his shadow mop, while everyone expected, without much hope, for a new day. Old John, owner of the Alvarado farm, felt the weight of his 70 years as never before. Each wrinkle on his face, carved by the sun and time, seemed to go deepened with each passing time. His hands, which had helped bring hundreds of lives to this world, and who knew the earth as the palm of themselves, now seemed useless and weak. He stood by the fence of Goliath, the straw hat in his hands as a sign of respect and despair, and watched the creature that was the pulsating heart of his creation. John was not just a cattle breeder. He was a guardian. Each animal had a name, a story, a place in your heart. And Goliath, with his noble force and his once indomitable spirit, occupied a special place. Seeing him in that state of abandonment was a stab to his chest, an affront to everything he believed about life and care. He had built that farm with sweat and perseverance, turning a piece of dry land into an oasis of life. But now, in the face of the pain of a single animal, he felt completely powerless, a king observing his collapsed kingdom. He vividly remembered the day Goliath was born, a robust and stubborn calf who had refused to breastfeed in the early hours, a foreshadowing of a strong personality. And he remembered the star, the mare, approaching the newborn curiously, establishing from the first moment a bond that challenged the logic of species. John had observed that friendship flourish over the years, a source of admiration and tenderness. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the depth of the emptiness that Star's death had left. He had been a similar void when his wife Maria had left a few years ago. The pain, he knew, was a wild animal that could not be tamed with strings or orders. But a man can cry, he can speak, can find comfort in others. A bull, on the other hand, could only suffer in monumental silence, an agony that consumed his own essence. And it was this silence that was killing John inside, the inability to connect, to offer a word of comfort that could be understood. John's attempts were numerous and increasingly desperate. He himself prepared Goliath's food, mixing his favorite grains with molasses, speaking with the bull in a low and pleading tone, as if talking to a stubborn son. "Come on, my great friend. Come on, Goliath. You need to be strong. Star wouldn't like to see you like this," he murmured, his voice embargoed by emotion. He spent hours sitting on a stool near the fence, simply keeping company with the bull, hoping that his presence could somehow convey the security and love he felt. But Goliath remained inert, his eyes closed to the world, his heart closed to any comfort. Each sunrise was a new reminder of its failure. The farm, which had always been his sanctuary, his place of peace, now looked like a battlefield where he waged a lost war against death and melancholy. Responsibility weighed on his shoulders, not just as an owner, but as a friend of that magnificent creature. The other farm workers looked at Schwau with a mixture of penalty and respect. They saw their suffering, the way he had aged years in just 5 days. They offered suggestions, shared stories of other stubborn animals that had overcome diseases, but nothing seemed to apply to the case of Goliath. The situation was beyond the practical experience of anyone. It was a problem of the soul, and they were men used to dealing with problems of body and earth. Collective impotence created a palpable tension. The work continued. The cows needed to be milked. The fences needed repairs. But everything was done with an air of solemnity, as if the entire farm were in a state of early mourning. The figure of John, standing next to the surrounded for hours, became a symbol of that fight, a captain who refused to abandon his ship, even when the waters already covered him. On the night of the 5th day, John felt that he had reached the limit of his resistance. He slowly walked back to the farmhouse, his heavy steps dragging the dust off the ground. The house, once full of life and the smell of Maria's coffee, now looked great and empty. He sat on his old leather armchair where he had so often planned the farm's future, and felt the tears he had held for days finally dripping through his tanned face. They were tears of frustration, sadness, and a deep feeling of loss. Loss by Star, imminent loss by Goliath, and loss of his own sense of competence, of being the man who could fix anything. He felt a failure, not only as a farmer, but as a living being unable to relieve the suffering of another. In that moment of deep darkness, he made a silent prayer, not to a specific saint, but to the universe, to any force he could hear. He did not ask for a miracle, but for a sign, for one direction, for something he could do. It was then that a thought, a distant memory, came in his tired mind. The memory of this granddaughter, Lillian, the daughter of her son, a girl who lived in the city and who he had not seen for almost a year. Lillian was blind from birth, a condition that made her perceive the world in a way that no one else could. She didn't see with her eyes, but with her hands, with her ears, and as her grandmother used to say, with her heart. There was a purity in it, a sensitivity that seemed to connect with others at a deeper level. John remembered how when she was a child, she calmed the most raw dogs with a simple touch, how the most scared cats were nestled in her lap. It was an absurd idea, a shot in the dark born of the purest despair. What could a blind girl in town do by a dying ton bull? It seemed crazy. But madness at that moment was the only thing that looked hope. Driven by this sudden and irrational spark, John stood up. His hesitation became a firm resolution. He walked to the old album phone on the living room wall and with his trembling fingers dialed his son's number. The conversation was short and direct. He did not go into detail about the depth of his anguish, but the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. He asked his son to bring Lillian to the farm. "I need her here," he said simply, without offering a logical explanation, because there was none. His son, on the other end of the line, realized the gravity in his father's voice, and even without understanding, agreed to leave the next morning. When he turned off the phone, John did not feel a complete relief, but the paralysis of despair had been broken. He had taken an attitude, no matter how illogical. He was clinging to a thread of hope, the idea that his granddaughter's innocence and unique perception could succeed where strength and experience had failed. He spent the rest of the night in vigil, no longer beside the surroundings of Goliath, but on the porch of the house, looking at the stars. He thought of Lillian, in his kind way to interact with the world. She didn't see the grandeur of Goliath. She wouldn't see her scary size. She would see only what she could feel, the texture of her skin, the warmth of her breathing, the vibration of her pain. Maybe, just maybe, that was the key. Perhaps the vision was a distraction, a barrier that prevented others from actually seeing the soul of the animal. Perhaps Lillian's blindness was actually a superior form of vision. He didn't know if he was being a fool or a genius, a desperate grandfather clinging to a fantasy. But he knew he couldn't simply let Goliath die without trying this last and unlikely chance. Hope was a small, hesitant flame in the darkness of his concern, but it was enough to keep him awake, waiting for dawn. At dawn on the 6th day, John felt a new energy, a mixture of anxiety and expectation. He went to the surrounded of Goliath. The bull was still alive, but his breath was even weaker. John put his hand on the wooden fence and spoke to the animal, no longer with supplications, but with a promise. "Hand on firm, my friend. Help is on the way. A help different from anything you've ever seen." He didn't know if Goliath could understand him, or even hear him, but he needed to say those words for both the bull and himself. He was betting everything on a 10-year-old girl, in her sensitivity, a magic he barely understood, but she felt real. Despair had led him to a place beyond logic, a place where the only thing left was faith. Faith in connection, faith in innocence, and faith that the heart, even that of an old callous farmer, could still have the hope of witnessing a miracle. The dust on the distant road, which would soon announce the arrival of his son and granddaughter, was now the focus of all his attention. The old car of John's son raised a cloud of red dust as he traveled the long dirt road that led to the headquarters of the Alvarado farm. For John, who waited on the porch, that cloud of dust was like the announcement of a herald, bringing with him the last and most fragile of his hopes. When the car finally stopped, the morning silence was broken by the family sound of the engine dying and the doors opening. John's son left, his face marked by concern and confusion, but his eyes conveyed unconditional support to his father. And then, on the passenger side, Lillian emerged, guided by his father's hand. She was a small, delicate figure, wearing a simple cotton dress that danced softly with the morning breeze. Her dark hair was stuck in a braid, and her eyes, in a deep blue focused, seemed to look inside to a world that she only knew. She did not carry the white cane she wore in the city. On the farm, she trusted other senses to guide her, the sound of her feet on the earth and her father's firm hand. Lillian took a deep breath, and a soft smile illuminated his face. "The smell of Grandpa's farm," she said, her clear voice like the sound of a bell. "Smell of wet earth, hay, and of sadness." The last word was said in a low tone, almost a whisper, and took his father and grandfather by surprise. John approached and hugged his granddaughter, feeling the fragility of his small bones, but also an inner force that always surprised him. How could she feel sadness in the air? Was it the intuition of a child, or something else? A keen perception born of his lack of vision. He asked no questions. He just held her hand, a soft hand in his, calloused and rough, and felt an inexplicable wave of calm. Lillian's presence was like a fresh breeze on a stuffy day, bringing with him a purity that seemed displaced amid the anguish he had taken over the farm in recent days. It was the embodiment of innocence, a reminder of a less complicated world where things were felt instead of analyzed. "Grandpa, why are you so worried?" Lillian asked as they walked toward the house. "Your heart is beating very fast." John looked at his granddaughter with admiration. She didn't need to see her face to read her emotions. She listened to them in the rhythm of her wrist, the tension of her hand. He decided to be honest. He sat her on the porch and in simple words told him the story of Goliath. He spoke about his strength and his pride, his great friendship with the star mare, and the deep sadness that led him to give up living. He did not try to hide the severity of the situation or his own hopelessness. He spoke to her not as a child, but as a confidant, like someone he believed he could understand the language of the heart, a language that transcended words and species. Lillian listened carefully, his head inclined to the side, his serious, compensated face. She did not interrupt, just absorbed each word, her fingers tracing the wood standards of the seat where she was sitting. When John finished his story, the silence stopped between them for a long moment. John's son watched the scene in a distance, skeptical, but touched by his father's faith. He saw what Goliath's condition had done with the old man, and if he brought his daughter here to give him some comfort, he was willing to accept. Lillian finally lifted his face toward his grandfather. Can I go see him?" she asked. His voice was soft but firm. There was no fear in his tone, just a sincere desire to approach. "I want to feel his pain, Grandpa." The phrase, said with such simplicity, hit John with the strength of a revelation. She didn't want to see the bull. She wanted to feel her pain. It was exactly that, empathy in its purest form. John nodded, his throat tight by emotion. "Of course, my dear, of course you can." He felt like a man on the verge of a cliff, taking a step in the dark, trusting that something or someone would support him. The walk to the surrounded of Goliath was slow and solemn. John held Lillian's hand, guiding her by the irregular terrain. The farm pedestrians stopped their work to observe, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. The vision of a small blind girl being taken close to a ton bull, even one weakened, was something that challenged common sense. Some murmured with each other, worried about the child's safety, thinking that the desperation of the old boss had led him to crazy. But there was also a spark of hope in the eyes of some, the hope that they were about to witness something extraordinary, something they would tell their children and grandchildren. Lillian looked alien to all this. She concentrated on the sounds, the rustle of the leaves, the distant corner of a bird, and as they approached, the slow and heavy breath coming from inside the surroundings. She stopped a few meters from the fence. "He's too big," she whispered, not afraid, but with admiration. John wondered as she knew. She couldn't see him, but somehow she could feel her mass, her presence. Perhaps because of the sound of your breath, perhaps for a subtle change in air pressure. "Yes, he is," said John. "He is our giant." Lillian let out his grandfather's hand. "I want to go closer," she said. "Alone." Lillian's father stepped forward, ready to protest, but John stopped him with a look. There was something in Lillian's posture, a serene confidence that demanded respect. John opened the surrounding gate slowly, the creak of the hinges sounding loudly in the tense silence. Lillian entered, step by step, his bare feet feeling the texture of the dry earth. She moved with caution that was not fear, but respect. She was entering the sacred space of a mourning creature, and she knew that. All eyes were fixed on her, the small figure in her cotton dress, slowly approaching the huge dark mass that lay propped on the floor. The whole world seemed to have stopped breathing. Lillian's arrival was not the arrival of a healer with a magic potion. It was the arrival of purity. It did not bring with it the knowledge of the veterinarians or the experience of the farmers. It brought something much more fundamental, an open heart, free from the prejudices of vision. For her, Goliath was not a frightening animal or valuable asset. He was a living being who was suffering, and his instinctive answer was not to analyze or fix it, but to connect. His blindness, which the world saw as a limitation, was actually his greatest strength at that time. She freed her from the fear and intimidation that Goliath's physical appearance inspired by others. She didn't see the giant. She felt the giant soul inside him, a soul that was shrunk by pain. His silent presence was already changing the atmosphere, replacing the energy of despair with the energy of pure and simple compassion. She stopped just one step from the great bull. Goliath did not move, but one of his ears contracted slightly, recording the unusual and silent presence. Lillian stayed there for a long moment, just listening to his breath, slowly hitting her heart, that she could almost feel through the floor, listening to the silence loaded with pain that surrounded him. She was like a musician tuning her instrument, tuning with the frequency of Goliath's sadness before trying to touch her own consolation melody. The tension between the viewers was almost unbearable. What would she do? What would she say? The girl who saw with her heart was now before the giant's broken heart, and no one knew what to expect from that impossible encounter. Hope and fear fought a silent battle in the hearts of all who watched. Lillian's arrival represented the intersection of two worlds, the world of brute strength and animal pain, and the world of human sensitivity and innocent empathy. It was the colossal meeting with the delicate, the visible with the invisible. In that dusty surrounding, under the strong sun of the backlens, a fundamental truth was about to be revealed. That true communication does not happen through the eyes or even words, but from heart to heart. The girl who could not see was about to make everyone around her see something new, something about the nature of connection, love, and healing. His arrival was not just the hope of saving a bull. It was a lesson that would be recorded forever in the memory of the Alvorada farm. The silence that followed was the prelude to a moment that would change everything. Lillian was still before Goliath's massive body, a small statue of calm in the midst of a sea of tension. For observers outside the fence, the scene was surreal. The size disparity was impressive, almost scary. The girl seemed so fragile, so vulnerable, before the mountain of muscles and bones that was the bull, even in her weakened state. The midday sun was hitting hard, creating an oblivioning glow on dust, but inside the surrounding time seemed to have stopped. The only sound was Goliath's heavy and intermittent breath and the occasional tinnitus of a fly. Lillian made no sudden movement. She simply stayed there, present, allowing her calm and non-threatening energy to spread throughout. She was not an intruder. She was a respectful visitor, asking for permission to enter a pain sanctuary. His closed eyes seemed more focused than any pair of open eyes, focused on feeling the environment, reading the invisible currents of emotion emanating from the great animal. Slowly, as if testing the temperature of the water, Lillian knelt on the dry earth. The movement was so soft and deliberate that it barely disturbed the air. She did not care about her clean dress dirty. His attention was totally focused on Goliath. When kneeling, she placed herself at a lower level, an instinctive gesture of submission and respect. She was not there to master or to force, but to offer. From her little bag she carried her shoulder, she took something. It was not food, no medicine. It was a small flower of the field, a yellow daisy that she had probably harvested on the way. She held her gently between her fingers, a vibrant color point in a scene dominated by tones of earth and the darkness of the tortoise coat. The gesture was so simple, so childish in its purity, that it seemed absurd to some of the pawns they watched. What could a flower do for a dying bull? But for Lillian, it was an offering, a symbol of life and beauty that still existed in the world. With the flower in one hand, Lillian spread the other slowly toward Goliath's head. His hand did not tremble. It moved through the air with a quiet certainty, an extension of his peaceful intention. She did not try to touch her eyes or muzzle, sensitive areas that could scare him. Instead, she looked the vast length of her neck, an area of strength and power. When the tip of its fingers finally touched the rough, hot skin of the bull, a wave of shock seemed to go through the viewers. Many arrested their breath, waiting for a violent reaction. But Goliath did not move. The only answer was a slight tremor that tore your skin, almost imperceptible muscle spasm, as if a sensation memory had been awakened from a long sleep. The tortoise's ear moved again, turning toward the touch, like a radar capturing a weak, distant signal. Lillian kept his hand there, without affection, just establishing contact, a bridge of heat between two living beings. The silence was deep and absolute. All the farm sounds seemed to have faded. The pedestrians, John, his son, were all mere spectators of a silent drama that unfolded before them. Lillian started talking, but not with words. She started humming. It was a simple melody without letter, a lullaby that his grandmother, John's late wife, used to sing for her. The melody was soft and repetitive, like the sound of a stream running over stones. It was not tall, just a murmur that barely reached the ears of those outside the fence. It was a sound that asked nothing, required nothing. It was just a sound presence, a vibration of calm and comfort that filled the space between it and the bull. The melody seemed to make a web of tranquility around them, isolating them from the rest of the world, creating a bubble of intimacy in the middle of the dusty surrounding. So something extraordinary happened. Goliath, who did not move his head voluntarily for days, slowly, with an effort that seemed monumental, became his great skull toward Lillian. His eyes, which were opaque and lifeless, opened a little more. He didn't look at her with aggression or fear, but with a kind of tired curiosity. It was as if the soft melody and the kind touch had penetrated the thick layers of their pain, reaching something deep inside it. He let out a sigh, a long, deep exhale of air that raised a small cloud of dust from the floor. It was not a sigh of agony, but something that sounded like resignation, or perhaps the beginning of a surrender to that soothing presence. Lillian did not stop humming. She continued with her smooth melody, her hands still paunting her neck, an anchor point in her sea of sadness. Skepticism in the faces of spectators began to become astonishment. Lillian then brought his face closer to the bullhead, such a deep act of trust that he made his grandfather's heart stop for a second. She leaned her forehead on her rough skin, just above her eyes. She closed her own eyes harder, as if focusing on her entire being. She remained like this, forehead with forehead, for a long moment. What was happening between them? Was it a transfer of energy? A silent communication that only they could understand? No one knew, but the image was of a breath-cut beauty. The blind girl and the giant bull, sharing a moment of deep connection, as if they were the only two creatures in the universe. The strong sun looked less aggressive. The breeze looked smoother. Nature seemed to be blessing that sacred encounter, that dialogue without words between innocence and pain. The flower Lillian held, the little yellow daisy, she put her softly on the floor, right in front of the Goliath muzzle. It was not an attempt to make him eat. It was a gift, a small piece of colorful life offered to the darkness of his mourning. Goliath looked down at the flower. Her big muzzle contracted, smelling gently. He didn't eat her. But the simple act of recognizing his presence, of interacting with something outside his own misery, was a gigantic step. It was the first sign of interest in the outside world that he showed in almost a week. A lone tear flowed down John's face, a tear not of sadness, but of an overwhelming emotion he could not name. It was a mixture of relief, admiration, and gratitude. He was witnessing the purest form of magic, the magic of empathy. The silent meeting did not solve the problem instantly. Goliath did not get up and started eating. But something fundamental had changed. A door that was firmly locked, now unlocked, an established connection. Lillian had proved that it was possible to reach the giant in his fortress of pain. She didn't heal him with a touch, but she reminded him that the touch existed. She didn't feed him with food, but she fed him with compassion. She showed him that he was not alone in his suffering, that another living being was willing to sit with him in his darkness without judgment and without fear. That silent encounter was the preparation of the terrain, the plowing of a soil that had become hard and sterile. It was the necessary step before any healing seeds could be planted. When Lillian finally got up and moved slowly, she left behind more than a small yellow flower. She left behind a possibility. She left behind proof that deeper communication does not need sound or vision. Goliath followed her with his eyes until she came out of the surrounding. And for the first time in 5 long days, there was a shine of something beyond pain in those dark eyes. It was not yet hope, but it was a spark of conscience, a recognition that the world contained more than the memory of its loss. The silent meeting had ended, but its echo would resonate for a long time. The stage was now mounted to the next act, to the words that needed to be said, to the secret that would be whispered. The whole farm expected, now no longer in despair, but with a reverent admiration. After the moving silent meeting, Lillian did not completely move away. She remained near the fence, sitting on a small wooden crate that her grandfather got to her, like a vigilant sentinel. She didn't talk to anyone. Her attention was totally turned to the surroundings, to the large, dark form that still lay on the floor. She seemed to be waiting for the right moment, by a sign that only she could see. The sun began to descend on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, and a cooler breeze began to blow, carrying the smell of the approaching night. The atmosphere on the farm had changed dramatically. The tension of despair had been replaced by an expectant stillness. Everyone felt that they had witnessed the prelude to something important, and now awaited the conclusion. John sat not far from his granddaughter, respecting his silence, his faith in the girl now as solid as the earth under his feet. He trusted his instinct, his wisdom that did not come from the books, but from the heart. The hours passed slowly. The night fell, and the stars began to tip the dark velvet of the sky. Someone lit a lamp, whose yellowish light cast dancing shadows. Goliath had not gotten up, but there was a subtle change in his posture. He didn't seem so completely delivered. His head was raised from the floor, and his eyes followed Lillian's movements across the fence. He was aware of her, connected to her in a way that no one understood. It was as if the previous meeting had created an invisible wire between them, a communication channel that remained open. Lillian seemed to feel this connection. She didn't need to see him to know that he was watching her. She felt her focus, her attention, and knew that the door she had unlocked was still ajar. She was just being patient, waiting for him to be ready to hear, not just with his ears, but with his soul. Finally, when the moon was tall in the sky and most of the farm sounds had quiet, Lillian stood up. She turned to her grandfather and said in a low voice, "I think now he'll hear me." There was a certainty in his voice that left no room for doubt. She walked again towards the surrounding gate. This time, no one questioned. No one was afraid. Everyone felt they were participating in a sacred ritual. John opened the gate for her once again, and Lillian entered the surroundings, under the pale light of the moon and lamp. She approached Goliath with the same calm and respect as before. The great bull watched her approach, and this time, when she knelt beside her head, he did something that surprised everyone. He let out a low, smooth mute. It was not a sound of pain or protest, but a sound of recognition, almost an invitation. It was the first time he had vocalized in days, and the sound, though weak, was a sign of life. Lillian smiled, a smile that the lamplight captured in all its sweetness. She leaned close to the Goliath's great ear, so close that her lips almost touched his skin. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. The wind stopped blowing. The nearest cricket silenced his corner. The moment had arrived. What would she say? What magical words could cure such a big and broken heart? John, his son, the pedestrians, all leaned forward, desperately trying to hear what would be said. But Lillian's words were not for them. They were for Goliath, and only for him. She began to whisper, her voice so low that it was like the rustle of dried leaves, a secret shared between her and the giant. The sound was inaudible to anyone else, brought by the wind as soon as it came out of their lips, intended only for the bull's ear. She whispered for a long time. Her small body trembled slightly with the intensity of her concentration. She was not just talking, she was spilling her soul in the ear of Goliath. What did she say? Later, when pressed by his curious grandfather, Lillian would reveal the essence of his secret. She didn't talk about living or dying. She gave her no orders to eat. She did not try to minimize her pain. Instead, she validated her. She whispered to him about Star. She said she understood how big his love was, how deep was the hole that her departure had left. She talked about the beauty of their friendship, about the memories he kept in his heart, memories that no one could take from him. She told her that it was right to miss it, that it was right to cry inside. She gave him permission to suffer. She was not trying to erase her pain, but sharing her. And then she whispered the most important part of her secret. She told her about her own Star. She told Goliath that Star would not like to see him like this. That her love for him was so great that her greatest joy was to see him strong and happy. She whispered that Estrella had not disappeared forever, but her energy, her love was now part of everything around. The sun that warmed her back, the grass that grew in the field, the wind that blown into her coat. She is no longer by your side, Goliath, Lillian whispered, because now she's inside you. Each time your heart beats, it's her beating with you. If you let your heart stop, hers too. You need to keep living, not for you, but for her, to keep her memory alive, to honor the love you have shared. Eating is not forgetting. While Lillian whispered these words of deep wisdom, something amazing began to happen. A tear, a single big tear, graduated in the corner of Goliath's eye and slowly drained by his dusty face. An animal crying. It was something that most men had never seen and would never see again. It was not a tear of pain, but of liberation. It was as if the girl's words had finally given voice to her agony, allowing her to flow out instead of stuck, poisoning him inside. He let out another sigh, this time deeper, a sound that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul, a sound of relief, a weight being taken from his shoulders. He turned his head, and with surprising delicacy for a creature of his size, he brushed his muzzle on Lillian's arm, a gesture of gratitude, of understanding. Lillian finished his whisper and slowly walked away, letting his words echo in the silence of the night. She got up and walked back to the gate, her work finished. She didn't look back. She knew with certainty that only innocence can have, that she had done what she had come to do. She had planted the seed. Now it was Goliath to decide if it would irrigate it. John hugged his granddaughter tightly, tears now running freely through his own face. He didn't need to know exactly what she had said. He becomes the result. He becomes the miracle that his despair had led him to seek. He becomes the connection between a blind child and a broken-heart bull, a connection that had saved a life. Everyone remained silent for a long time, watching Goliath. The bull remained lying for a few more minutes, as if processing everything he had heard. Then, with an effort that shivered all his muscles, he began to get up, first leaning on the front paws, then with a moan of effort, raising its massive rear. He stood, hesitant at first, his legs weak from days of inactivity and hunger. He shook his head, as if awakening from a long nightmare. And then he took a step, and then another. He walked slowly, but with purpose, towards the food that had remained untouched for so long. The whispered secret in the wind was not a magical formula, but a deep and universal truth. Love does not end with death, and the best way to honor those who are gone is to embrace the life they helped us to love. Under the attentive and marvelous look of all, Goliath took his first steps toward life. Each movement was deliberate, loaded with the weight of his journey back from the abyss. He arrived in the trough, where the fresh hay and the grains that had been offered so many times in vain still expected him. He stopped for a moment, looking at the food as if he was seeing it for the first time. He lowered his massive head and with a hesitant sniff took a small hay of hay. The sound of his masterpiece, slow and weak at first, was the sweetest song John had ever heard. It was the sound of victory, the sound of life reaffirming its rule over death. No one applauded, no one shouted. The moment was too sacred to be broken by human noise. They only observed, in a reverent silence, while the giant, back to the scene, smiled. She didn't need to see. She could hear the promise of a new dawn in the sound of the chewing of Goliath. Goliath ate slowly that night, and then drank a long and deep amount of water, as if he was washing not only his thirst, but also the last traces of his paralyzing mourning. He did not turn back into the vibrant and powerful bull that he was overnight. Recovery would be a slow process, but the decision had been made. He had chosen his life. He had chosen to honor the memory of Star living instead of dying with her. Lillian's words had given him a new perspective, a new reason to continue. He was not forgetting his friend. He was immortalizing her, carrying her spirit ahead in every step she took, in every breath she took. The promise of a new dawn was not just about the sun that would be born in a few hours. It was about the rebirth of hope and purpose in the giant's heart. The next morning, when the first golden rays played the Alvarado farm, a scene of peace and renewed normality greeted John. Goliath was standing in the middle of his surrounding, no longer lying in despair, but watching the world around him with a new interest in his eyes. The opacity of his pain had been replaced by a soft glow of acceptance. When one of the keepers approached the morning food, Goliath did not hesitate. He ate with an appetite that, although not yet his old voracious appetite, was firm and constant. The news spread through the farm like a fire of joy. The giant was back. The sadness he had hovered on the farm for almost a week dissipated like the morning mist, replaced by smiles, animated conversations, and a deep feeling of gratitude. The Alvarado farm had its heart back, beating hard once again. Lillian and his father prepared to leave that same day. His mission was accomplished. Before entering the car, Lillian asked to say goodbye to Goliath. John took her to the surrounded one last time. Goliath, seeing her approaching, walked to the fence and lowered her head, allowing her to touch her muzzle. No more words or whispers were needed. The connection between them was palpable, a bond of gratitude and understanding that transcended the barriers of species and meanings. "Stay well, my big friend," Lillian said, rubbing her hand gently through his rough skin. "Remember the promise." Goliath released a low and happy mute, as if he said yes, he would remember. John observed the scene, the heart overflowing with love for his granddaughter, the little girl who saw more deep than anyone with the perfect vision he had ever known. Lillian's touch left an echo of magic on the farm. The story of the bull that refused to eat and the blind girl who saved him with a whisper became a legend, told and retold, growing with each narration. It became part of the identity of the Alvarado farm, a permanent reminder of the power of empathy, innocence, and communication that comes from the heart. John never looked at his animals the same way. He had always respected them, but now he saw in them a depth of emotion and awareness he once just suspected. He learned from his granddaughter to hear not only from his ears, but with his soul, to pay attention to the silences as much as to sounds. Lillian's lesson transformed not only Goliath, but to all who witnessed the miracle. Over the weeks and months, Goliath recovered all his strength. His coat shines again as an obsidian, his muscles rippled with renewed power, and the call of life in his eyes burned stronger than ever. But there was something different about him. There was a new wisdom in his gaze, a calm that did not exist before. He was still the king of the farm, but now he ruled with a quiet majesty, as if he understood the cycles of life and death in a deeper way. He never had another companion as close as Star, but he didn't seem like lonely. It was as if he carried her company inside him, glad with the memory and love that continued to nourish him. It has become a living symbol of resilience and depth of effective ties. The history of Goliath and Lillian teaches us that the greatest wounds are not those of the body, but those of the soul, and the healing for these wounds is rarely found in medicines or logic. The healing comes from the connection, the empathy, the desire to sit with the other in his darkness and to share the weight of his pain. Lillian did not heal Goliath with a magic pass. She healed him for refusing to see him as a problem to be solved. She saw him as a sense deserving of respect and compassion. She heard him when no one else could, and gave her the words her soul needed to find the way back to the light. She reminds us that in an often blind world for what she sees, there are those who see with the heart that have the truest vision. The Alvarado farm continued to prosper, and life followed its course. But for all who lived those 6 days of anguish and miracle, it was nothing more exactly the same. They carried the memory of that extraordinary encounter as a treasure. The promise of a new dawn that Goliath embraced that day has become a metaphor for his own lives. No matter how dark the night of the soul is, no matter how deep the pain of loss is, there is always the possibility of a new dawn, as long as there is a heart willing to connect with another, whispering a secret of hope to the wind and repeatedly choosing life. And so, the legend of the bull and the blind girl lives, an eternal testimony that love is the most powerful force of the universe, a force that can indeed call a soul back from the border of death and promise to him a new and glorious dawn. Goliath, the giant who learned to live for two, became the silent guardian of this truth, his strong heart beating in unison with the memory of his friend and the wisdom of a girl who taught him to see the light in darkness, find life in the promise of every new day. The farm was no longer just a workplace. It was a place of wonders, with everyone knew that miracles were possible.